Taking King Creel's blows on my back, I curled up into a ball and just accepted that he was going to beat me until he finally got bored. It took a long time. And in the end only a phone ringing from his office tore his attention from me. He looked over to his office and then down to me. Sighing annoyed, he kicked me hard with his dress shoes and turned to enter his office. I sat there and slowly managed to pull myself up onto the counter. I gasped to try and catch my breath. Finally getting my bearings, I looked up to see Mama Creel staring at me with a silver platter with a coffee pot and a fancy-looking coffee cup. I looked at her in confusion. Was she offering me a cup of coffee? Don't get the wrong idea. Bring this to Charles. He's going to be on the call for a while, she said, shoving the tray at me. I caught it quickly, looking down at all the items clanging around. Great. Now I'm his butler. Why didn't I go to college? Sighing and nodding obediently and walked over towards his office. Knocking softly, I pushed my way into the office and stared at him as he talked to someone through a rotary phone. Monsieur Leblanc. Comment allez vous? Oui tout va bien ici. J'espère que vous êtes votre petite infirmière allez bien, he said with a genuine chuckle. I stared confused at Creel, never having heard him speak French once in my entire time of knowing him. Not only was he a good speaker, it sounded like he had always spoken that language. Keeping my head down, I walked over to him and sat his cup down. Softly pouring some of the black coffee into his cup, he grabbed me by the shoulder and shoved me out of the way once it was enough. Quelle. Non juste ma stupide marionnette. Sinclair. Qui sait, je n'ai pas entendu parler de lui depuis des mois. He mumbled into the phone, shooing me away with his hand and forcing me out of his office as he grabbed the cup I had poured for him and took a sip as he nodded to the receiver phone. Sighing once I was out of the office, I returned to my position at the counter as I looked down at its endless dust. So, you met the Baron? Creel's mother asked me as she sat in a rocking chair making a voodoo doll. She sewed the little doll without even looking. She just stared at me as she did so. I looked at her and then to the office, saying nothing as I nodded to her. She nodded and sighed as she finally looked down at her doll. When Charles died, I acted out of anger and sheer grief, and agreed that if I supplied him with as many bodies as he wanted, he would never allow my son to die again, she said with a sigh, rubbing the doll's little head and closing her eyes. He told me how to stop him. I mumbled softly, keeping my voice down to hide it from Creel. She looked back up at me with that smile that all mothers have, the one where she has pride over a child. Chuckling, she set the doll down on my counter. Bury him. I know. That's how Samedi takes us to the afterlife. Because Creel is undead and has never been buried, I was able to put his soul back into his body. As long as he never goes into the ground, he'll never die, she explained to me, looking at the little doll she had made in seemingly no time at all. It would also be how to put me back to rest. I looked at the woman who since I had first accidentally brought back to life by accident. She was informing me about how to beat her and her son. But why? She was his mother after all. She seemingly read my mind and stood to come over to me and take me softly by the shoulders. I shivered expecting a hit from her, but she instead wrapped her arms around me. I've made mistakes. And seeing what Charles has done with his second chance of life really has opened my eyes to my mistakes, she sighed, letting me go and fixing my hair like any mother does when they see something out of place. Will you help me? I whimpered to her, submissively looking down to the floor, expecting to be hit or hurt for even asking for her help. But she pushed my chin up to be able to look at her. Her motherly eyes looked down at me like I was a little lost, abused puppy. Our little chat was interrupted by Creel, who slammed the door to get our attention. We both looked over and stared at him as he watched the scene with a raised brow, walking over with his cane in his hands. Mama, what are you doing with my puppet? He asked, coming over to me and tapping his cane on the floor, causing me to stand up straight and rigid. Walking over to him, I stared at him in terror as he raised the cane up to scare me. Luckily, he was interrupted by the front door opening and a small child running and wrapping her arms around him. Mr. King Creel, Olivia hummed as she hugged him. His tone instantly changed as he turned to look at her with a bright smile, picking her up and smiling at her. Olivia. Why isn't it a surprise to see you here? He hummed as he sat her on the counter. I stared at her and then looked over to the door to see Alexandra standing there, too ashamed to look at me as she walked into the shop. She looked over to Mama Creole and bowed her head in respect to the old woman. "What are y'all doing here anyway?" he asked Olivia, the little girl looking up at him with her innocent little eyes. She then pointed over to the door. Following her fingers, he saw she was pointing at Alexandra, who moved out of the way and revealed Sophie crawling into the shop and staring up at Creole. She was looking worse, her human half rotting and her doll half leaking stuffing. "You," she snarled, pouncing up with speed and velocity enough to tackle Creole and sending him over to the counter as she attacked him. Creole let out a growl as he was tackled and attacked. His mother quickly rushed behind the counter to help him. I stared in awe at it, and with a quick snipping sound, I saw that Alexandra had rushed over and cut the strings holding me. "Quickly. We do not have much time," she said quickly, grabbing me by the tie and rushing out of the store. Olivia followed after us, apologizing to the Creoles over and over as we ran. I looked back at the shop as it went out of view. I looked over then to Alexandra, swallowing the bile building up in my throat. Why are you helping me?" I asked her softly. She looked over to me and sighed as she slowed down and let Olivia catch up with us. The little girl gasped and climbed into her mother's arms as she collapsed in exhaustion. Those little legs could only take her so far. "It's the right thing to do. I cannot leave you to suffer as Mary did for all those years. And if we lift the curse of Creole from you, then perhaps you may return to normal," she explained to me, pointing over to the cemetery in the distance. I looked over there and then looked back towards the shop. Creole's words echoed in my mind. That I had no one left. I had murdered my parents. I had been murdered and brought back to life for only one reason. To be the plaything of the Voodoo King Creole. "I don't know, Alexandra. What if I try and kill you?" I asked her. She scoffed and smiled at me. "You'll have to try very hard for that, Travis," she said with a smile. Taking my hand, she led me, while carrying Olivia in her other arm. We arrived at the cemetery gates and entered them. Looking around at the overgrown graves, we looked out for the Baron. Olivia, who was now out of her mother's arms, tugged on my dress pants. I looked down at her and got to her level. And she greeted me with Tempe in her hands. The little voodoo doll reached out and grabbed my face, holding on to me as I pulled away. He clung to me and refused to let go. I gave a soft, tired smile as I pulled him off and held him in my hands. He clung to my fingers then as he seemingly refused to be separated from me. "I missed you too, little guy," I chuckled. "Olivia, hand me the purse, baby girl," Alexandra asked. Olivia nodded happily and ran over to the gate and grabbed the bag. Bringing it to her mother, she smiled and received a head pat for her efforts. Fishing through the bag, Alexandra picked up a bottle of rum. "Thank you, Sophie," she sighed, holding the bottle up and shaking it. Seemingly instantly, a hand reached out and grabbed the bottle. The Baron appeared from the grave beneath her. He grabbed it and pulled himself up with some grunts. Patting the dirt off of him, he looked down lovingly to the bottle before looking over to me with a raised brow and a scoff. "You look like that asshole," he chuckled, putting the neck of the bottle in his mouth and biting it off. Spitting the top of the bottle away and swigging the rum like it was water. Letting out a satisfied groan as he pounded his chest with his hand. I looked at the floor to avoid his judgmental gaze. "We acquire your assistance, Baron Samedi," Alexandra said, causing the tall black man to look at her with a raised brow as he took a good long swig of the rum. Finally finishing his pull of the bottle, he looked at her with an interested gaze. "You're with him?" he asked, pointing over to me. She responded with a nod. He nodded and understood that we were all working against Creole. He took another swig and looked off towards the gate, pointing his finger over to the door and chuckling. "He's right outside. Whatever you're going to do, better do it quickly," he said with a soft giggle, going back into his hole with his bottle of rum. "Great help," I mumbled, softly rubbing Tempe's head with my thumb as I looked over to the gate. Indeed, the gate was thrown open as Creole and his mother entered it. In Creole's hand was what was left of Sophie. Body mangled beyond recognition, he tossed it to us and caused Olivia to run to Alexandra and hid behind her mother. "Oh, I've got all of you right where I want you," he chuckled, walking over and stepping on the corpse of Sophie. Walking over to us as his mother stayed by the gate entrance looking around the graveyard she had been buried in. "Travis, my boy, you want to prove to me that you're a good boy, don't you?" he asked me, tilting his head as he looked at me. I stared back at him. He was right. I just wanted to show him that I was good and didn't want to be punished anymore. How could I make it so I was a good boy? Maybe. If I kill Alexandra. She'd been such a problem to him ever since he had given her the second chance of being a mother. I began, but something pulled me back from the chain of thought. I looked down at Tempe as he pulled on my fingers. I looked down at him and he vigorously shook his head at me. Seeing him, I was able to pull myself back from the brink and stare up at the creature that had abused and hurt me for all this time. The creature that had caused me to kill my own parents and help him murder countless others. Go fuck yourself, Charles. I said angrily. He tilted his head at me. Like I had just spoken in some unknown language to me. He put his hand to his ear and cocked it towards me. Did I hear that correctly? Guess I'll have to beat some sense into you, he said with a giggle, coming over to me only for his mother to grab him by the shoulder. He looked back at her confused. Charles. Leave him. You can always create a different puppet. She pointed out to him. He looked to her like she had just stabbed him. He shrugged off her hand and stared at her in complete disbelief. What? He asked, staring at her and gritting his yellow teeth. You think I'm going to just let him go? After all the shit he's done to me, he screamed, his mouth wide open and snapping a good many of his stitches. His mother tried to calm him down, but he simply shoved her off of him. Charles. I always taught you never to be selfish. Just let him go, the poor boy has suffered enough. She begged, pushing her son back and pointing an accusing finger at him. The Voodoo King stared back at me and then to his mother. You brought me back to life. That was selfish. You kept me alive, that was selfish. You do not get to tell me never to be selfish, he shouted, turning to me and pointing. He will belong to me forever, he growled, grabbing his cane and coming over to me. I had backed up and had a gravestone between me and him. He came over to me and stepped on the grave, and I smiled at him. Watch your step, Charles, I said, pointing down to the grave as he came towards me. He stopped and had time to read the gravestone before he looked up at me in anger. His mother's grave, which she dug herself out of. He didn't have much time to react as the softer earth gave way and he tumbled down into the grave. He clambered his way up and began to pull himself up, but something seemingly began to drag him back down into the grave. He looked back in shock at what he saw. Baron Samedi pulled himself up to his level and smiled down at him. His black skin melting off his body until nothing but a skeleton smiled back at Creole. Time's up, Charlie boy. Looks like I finally get to drag your sorry ass down with me, he declared, sinking back into the grave as Creole dug his fingers into the dirt to try and pull himself up. He looked around frantically for his mother, but when their eyes made contact she simply looked away, leaving Creole as several skeletal hands rose up from the grave to start pulling him down into the grave. You think this is over, Travis? Just cause I'll be gone won't mean a thing. You hear me? You don't go unpunished for what you've done, he screamed as he began to lose grip on the dirt and grass. The skeletal hands pulling him down into the grave refused to let up. I'll see you in hell, I said, looking down at him as he was pulled further into the grave by the hands. He left me with one final smile as the dirt consumed him, and the last thing left of Charles Sumner, aka King Creole, was his top hat once he was dragged underneath the dirt. I stared at the grave, seemingly waiting for him to burst back from the grave. But he didn't, so. 95 years erased just like that. Mama Creole spoke up, bringing my attention over to her as she walked over to her own grave. She stood a good distance away from it, so she wouldn't immediately be dragged down under as well. He's right. I was being selfish when I brought him back and made him immortal. But I don't know any mother who wouldn't do that for their child, she said, looking over to Alexandra who was holding on to Olivia. Is he really gone? I asked her. She looked up at me and offered no answer to me. Just a simple smile as she approached the grave she had occupied. Her body seemingly returned to its rotten form as she was more gingerly sucked back into her grave, closing her eyes and accepting her fate. After so long. It was over. I looked over at Alexandra and Olivia who looked at me with some sense of fear. But when I came over to them, they offered me hugs and held me as I cried hard into them. Tempe clung to my hand as he comforted me as well. With my parents dead and no immediate family to take me in, I returned to their home. Despite my hopes and prayers, I remained the same. My body did not change back. I did not get my eyes back. I did not become who I used to be. I was cursed to remain a voodoo puppet. I spent a lot of time in my new room that Alexandra had given me. It was originally a guest room, but she left it to me to do what I wanted. I brought many of my items from my old room at home and brought them there. Olivia was so happy to have an older brother. At night when they sleep I stay wide awake staring out my window, expecting him to be there, expecting him to have found some way to claw his way out of hell and take me down with him. But he didn't. And somehow, I felt abandoned. Like I had been used and dumped after all my uses had been extinguished. It was hard adjusting to life with Alexandra and Olivia. Alexandra wasn't a mother to me, and I was no son to her. It was like they brought in an abused puppy and tried to treat it like nothing had happened at all. I would eat with them, watch TV with them, and even when I was feeling brave go with them shopping. But it never felt genuine. Tempe did the best he could to cheer me up. But a little voodoo doll can really only do so much. Each day dragged on and on. Alexandra tried to talk me into seeing a therapist, but what therapist would look at me and be able to help me? And I bet you guys are wondering about the elephant in the room. My blackouts. And my murderous tendencies. They haven't gone away. Where would they go after all? I didn't notice it beforehand. But people have been dying in our neighborhood. And more than a few of my clothes had to be gotten rid of. Otherwise, people would have seen the blood. Alexandra knows, oh of course she knows. She walked in on me climbing back into my window with blood all over me. Lucky me we understand each other. She doesn't tell, I don't hurt her. There isn't much more I need to tell you all anymore. After all, I can't have any of you finding out where I live and operate. Can't have any of you stopping my fun. Although I will leave you all with the promise of something in the future. After all, the flyer that was delivered in the mail says it all. Coming soon, the grand reopening of the half-priced voodoo store. Hopefully, they're hiring. I have prior experience after all.